Ella, thank you so much for coming in today and talking about the extraordinary novel that is Jaded. Let's start at the beginning, when you were writing it, how you were writing it. Tell us a bit about what inspired you to write Jaded, and can you recount those days that you spent in lockdown writing this novel?
Thank you for having me. Yeah, the character of Jade and the story had kind of been jostling in my head for a really, really long time before I even started writing. So I don't think I can pin down sort of one origination point, but it did all start with Jade, and her character was really character driven from the start, and she is inspired by my and my friends' first-hand experiences and observations as women of colour in the city, but more broadly women of colour in really white spaces. And from that, it was actually really easy to create Jade's character, Jade's world, Jade's relationship, and she kind of came alive sort of from the very first day. And then from there, the story just kind of flowed. I had this mixed race woman of colour, something really awful happens to her on the firm's watch. And unfortunately, it wasn't that hard to imagine how she would be received when she started questioning all the systems and beliefs that are skewed against her, aren't built for her, and her really starting to unpack why that is and sort of examine how she ended up where she is. In terms of writing it during lockdown, I started writing it in 2021. It's all a bit of a blur, and I remember it being this sort of frantic and rather feral time of my life.
And you were still a full-time lawyer at this point,
yeah.
Right? Okay, wow.
So I was writing mornings, evenings, weekends. I was taking up all my annual leave writing. As a result of it being really, really frantic, I did kind of get a first draft down really quickly, which then I think helped me with momentum.
And was it something that you just kind of felt you had to get out of your system? Or did you even at that point conceive of sending it to publishers? Were you just kind of like, I have this character and I have this framework of a story and I'm just going to let it flow out of me?
Pretty much. I didn't even really plot. I kind of just wrote chapter to chapter. I knew the sort of key plot points along the way, but I really didn't know how I was going to land the plane. And there's this very final conversation at the end of the book. And once I wrote that, I kind of was like, okay, I think I'm done now. I think it's finished. This is a nice point to end it. And then I submitted it to agents on the morning of my wedding because, why not add some stress to the day? And
Amazing.
it just kind of went from there.
I'm just imagining you clicking send whilst in your wedding dress. Was that kind of the vibe? Or?
I had all my makeup and hair done and I was still in my pajamas, and I was like, yeah, why not? Just go for it.
Great,
I don't recommend doing that.
No, that's quite high.
You don't want to detract from your day, but there you go.
So you click send on your wedding day, and then what happened?
So I sent to a first batch of about 4 or 5 agents, and then that was on a Saturday, and then on the Monday I followed up with another 4 or 5. I got a lot of about 2 or 3 swift rejections, and then pretty much everyone else wanted the manuscript. So I sent out the full manuscript, and then it moved really, really quickly. I got, quite a few offers, met everyone for lunch, or had long calls with them, settled with my agent Ela Lee, who's amazing, and we just kind of really connected, and I just thought the chemistry was right. So that was in October 2021. We edited the book together and submitted it in January 2022. The book deal kind of came around really, really quickly. It was just, like I said, it was a really feral time. It just kind of moved very quickly.
And you were still a full-time city lawyer at that point. When did you make, and how did you make the transition to being a full-time novelist?
It's been a really exciting period of change, sort of being a full-time author, and Jaded has allowed me to do that, and it's not lost on me kind of how lucky I am to be in that position. I can't say that I've managed the transition super well.
What's been the most difficult?
I think, so I applied to study law when I'd just gone 17, and I'm 28 now. So it's kind of like there's been this decade of throwing myself into one industry.
Yeah.
Trying to embody all the characteristics of a corporate lawyer to then leave into this completely different industry. And I think the toughest thing for me has been rethinking work as no longer being output based. So we call it, as lawyers, we call it attorney work product, and all your hours are billed. You essentially have to have something to show for your time and to show for all the hours that you've been working. Whereas writing, you can kind of go down 2 or 3 weeks worth of rabbit holes that end up not trickling down into your manuscript. And the first few months I was really tough on myself. I was really God, this is such a waste of time. I haven't achieved anything.
Yeah.
And
that's a huge psychological shift.
Yeah.
Like, you could just be thinking for 2 hours and not produce anything.
Exactly.
But like in a lawyer's mind, that's...
I got really hung up on like word counts and
Yeah.
schedules and timelines.
Right.
And a lot of that, it just isn't conducive to being creative. And I think also being a lawyer, and particularly litigation, which was the area that I practiced in, you're very much trained to be really cynical. You're very much trained to look for red flags and look for areas where something will go wrong, which again
That's what
wasn't...
you're paid to do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Preempt those crises.
And that's not particularly helpful when you're trying to be creative too. So I think almost instead of a learning curve, it's been like an unlearning curve, like trying to unlearn all of these thinking patterns that I've spent the last decade training myself to do, and kind of just being a bit easier on myself, and just kind of learning that creativity is kind of a lot more boundless and a lot less rigid.
And not always something you can judge by a number. Or
And it's not always productive.
And not always productive, indeed. Let's talk about Jaded, because I have to say, I absolutely loved it. And I loved it. I learnt so much. And I thought it was an insight into a world that I sort of knew. I have friends that are lawyers. I have little insights, but I just thought you beautifully painted this portrait of not only this profession, but this intersectional sort of myriad of personalities, forces, people, of where race, class, money, work, sex is just all so beautifully depicted. And Jade is at the centre of this chaos in a way.
Yeah.
And she's inhabiting two different worlds. Could you explain, without giving too much away, of course, what those two worlds are?
Yeah. So Jade is an ostensibly really successful, very educated, middle class, upwardly mobile woman of colour. And that is, from the outside, you might think she's got it all figured out. But at home, she's kind of this second generation immigrant success story with her boyfriend. They're in a really stable long-term relationship. And then at work, she's a real workhorse. And that is kind of a storyline that you see quite often in millennial novels in particular. Woman has it all, but is still, something's not quite right.
Yeah.
But that tends to be a white woman, and very rarely is that unpacked from the perspective of a woman of colour. Over the course of the book, there's this sort of slow motion, quite horrifying realization for Jade, where she realizes that she's never really belonged in any of the worlds that she's curated herself for, and her sort of continued existence in any of them requires a lot of compromise on her behalf. It was really to show that she kind of has been really quite complicit in a lot of this. She has actively, rather than making her world kind of fit to what she wants, the way Jade controls her world is by being different people for different environments, which is something I think a lot of people of colour, and particularly mixed race people, resonate with.
I mean, she's quite harsh on herself.
Yeah.
I felt like she calls herself a hypocrite at one point. And I just speak to that, about that element of her character, because that contortion is happening, and she is a mixed race woman in majority white spaces, professionally and romantic friendship group. That contortion she internalizes, and there's a lot of self-hate and self-criticism there, which I found quite difficult to read, actually.
Yeah. I think there's a really fine line between pressure to fit in and being sort of complicit in it and sort of actively contorting yourself. She didn't start off calling herself a hypocrite, and I added that quite later on, and it was quite an active choice, because I don't think we learn a lot from really confident, self-assured characters. We kind of
we want them dysfunctional.
I kind of wanted her to have the space to not be perfect, and to kind of really criticize herself and see where she's fallen short, as well as where everyone else in her life has let her down. Because there is a lot of discussion about the expectation of victims to be perfect in order to deserve sympathy and in order to be believed. And I really wanted her to not always be sure that she's made the right choices, but still deserve that from the reader.
I mean, obviously race, culture and class very much intersect in Jaded. It feels so fresh because there's such a level of complexity and nuance when you discuss those issues. And, you know, you're really getting to the heart in Jaded about, you know, what makes up identity formation. And it is wonderfully contrasted in the book. The sort of reductive nature of corporate diversity and inclusion initiatives.
Yeah.
Tell us about that and please explain it, because it's funny, but also just brilliantly illuminating.
Yeah. I just wanted to actually have a bit of fun with it and kind of make the reader squirm a little bit.
Yeah.
I can imagine a lot of corporate people have sort of experienced meetings like that. What I was really getting at is just how flattening a lot of these initiatives can be. You know, there's a women's group, and then there's, for example, in law, lawyers of colour group, and then there's the Asian lawyers group, and then there's the LGBTQ group. But there's almost little to no space for intersectionality and little to no understanding of intersectionality, and sort of how a lot of people like Jade straddle multiple groups, and there's kind of no understanding of how that is dynamic.
Right, and belongs to none of them.
Exactly.
Because she's having to contort herself to, as we said earlier.
And it's this sort of constant exercise of having to minimise your otherness to fit into one, and then highlight your otherness to fit into another.
Right.
She's asked to, you know, join recruitment fairs because they want to see diversity, and they want to basically use her as exhibit A, and that's them, you know, highlighting her otherness. But then in other ways she can't express herself fully.
Be the poster girl when we want you to be, but don't exhibit other forms of your identity because it's uncomfortable for us to deal with.
Yeah, exactly.
And what was so interesting, I think, was that flattening that you so brilliantly describe, in that all the conversations around diversity within a corporate context and arguably at a societal level have no meaning for her. Yeah. Absolutely no meaning in her actual life.
Yeah.
And how she navigates her relationships, her friendships, her job.
Yeah.
None of it has any application.
No. Because that's the thing. She is a bit of a chameleon. Like, she's still a middle class, highly educated person. With that comes a lot of privileges. And as a result, it's almost like all of her friends and her boyfriend view her as, well, you've got nothing to complain about. You're the same as us. You went to the same university as us. You work the same jobs as us. Why is your experience any different to us? And that there's just that real crude understanding of race and privilege. And there's really just, what I wanted to unpack was, how do they all fit together for a person in moving through their day-to-day life?
And the parents. Talk a little about the parents, because they're such wonderful characters in the book.
Jade is mixed race. Her mother is Korean and her father is Turkish. And that is my own ethnicity, just because I really wanted to infuse that relationship with as much authenticity as possible and really make it the kind of primary source of like warmth and safety in the novel. They are first generation immigrants. They've come over and they've really made life for themselves. And there's a scene where they're all at home and it's kind of described as like their sanctuary and their sort of oasis. And at home, they kind of wholeheartedly celebrate their culture and their languages and their festivals. And it really feels like once they kind of enter the threshold of their home, Jade can kind of, you know, like after a meal where like you're really full and you unbutton your jeans. That's kind of how I imagine Jade to feel when she goes home. But then there are many ways in which they expect a lot of her. And I think that is what a lot of, you know, immigrant parents do expect of their children, is sort of to pay forward their hard work. So Jade does feel a little bit caught in that sense too, and she feels like she really has to keep pushing forward with law and this career because that's what her parents have given to her.
Yeah.
And she doesn't want to kind of squander that
inheritance. And also the relationship she has with her boyfriend. There's a disconnect
with him and her parents,
and with Jade and his parents as well. Yeah.
I think, again, I really wanted to kind of shine a light on when a lot of very highly educated white people kind of come into brown spaces. Unless you've grown up with it, it's hard to really understand how charged a lot of topics can be. So, he brings up the Korean War, or he brings up, lots of historical things that he's trying to show, look how read up I am on this. But he's trying to be impartial and logical and brash. And it's not like that. This is real people's history and real people's trauma that you're just kind of bringing up willy-nilly over lunch.
Showing how much you know.
Yeah.
How well
and it's quite self-serving.
Yeah, right.
So I really wanted to show that kind of dynamic.
In the wake of BLM and this idea of allyship, there was a lot of well-intentioned white people going, I need to read, I need to learn, I need to listen.
As long as that burden isn't being... Yeah.
Let's face it can be really sledgehammer stuff.
Yeah, and also it's like, you educate yourself and that's great, but you can't be putting the burden of that onto the people of colour in your lives and the black people in your lives. And you can't be expecting them to educate you or just bringing up really traumatic things just to show that you know about them.
Or showing how informed and liberal and progressive you are by showing your self-learning that you've done as a kind of peacocking of progressiveness.
Yeah, exactly.
Progressive credentials. So I want to just drill down on being a lawyer. And obviously, lawyers charge for their time every 6 minutes. I read in Jaded, has to be accounted for, which is extraordinary. In a way, the legal profession is the very definition of that intensification of work culture that we saw in the sort of really from the mid-90s, arguably to the pandemic. And I know lots of lawyers that are burnt out, and that term almost kind of can be applied to every lawyer I know, really. Do you think, though, that Jaded is having a conversation around work and work-life balance in a very kind of millennial way, questioning what's gone before? I mean, in the 90s, we had like those depictions of legal profession, of Ally McBeal, certainly glamorizing the profession.
Even like
and
Suits.
You had Suits and This Life. The law was lauded as a place where people kind of work hard, but also played hard. And it was all quite sexually freeing, professionally freeing. And women could be like, channel masculine energy. And it was this kind of place where opportunities were endless, and the unwritten rule was that you worked hard, but you also got to be paid really well and play really hard. I feel like Jaded, though, brilliantly, by the way, depicts the madness of work, what working in a law firm is like, most of which people who don't know probably won't believe.
It's so interesting because, as I was saying earlier, like the pipeline to becoming a lawyer is really long. You kind of have to invest many years into it before you actually qualify as a lawyer. So a lot of people commit to it young age. I was, like I said, 17, and then I was 19 when I got my training contract without actually knowing anything about the industry or what a day-to-day life would be. And there's a line in Jaded where it's like, I kind of imagined, based on shows, that working as a lawyer would be like lots of boozed up lunches and really short, intense meetings. But actually it's a lot of work. Coming back to whether it's sort of like a millennial experience, I don't necessarily think so. I think when I look at people really senior in the companies that I've worked for, they've been working really hard for a really long time. But I think the difference for millennials isn't just email, it's like constant availability that probably, even if you'd entered law 5 years earlier than I did, you probably didn't have that constant availability. And I really try to depict that in Jaded, where she has 2 different notification settings on her phone, one for work emails and one for personal emails, so that she's kind of conditioned herself to wake up at the sound of one particular notification because she truly feels like she can't miss anything. And I do think that kind of creates this burnout because you never feel like
work is done.
You never feel like you switched off. And it kind of results in this real constant tension that ends up, manifesting in physical and mental burnout, I think.
I mean, the feeling that's created within the novel is just like she's never resting. Like
There's
she's
no
never
bandwidth.
off.
Yeah.
She's, she doesn't eat properly. She's just always on the way to work, at work, or coming back from work. There's no let up at all. And I think that's really, really well depicted and frightening to read. I was horrified.
It ended up being the perfect industry to place someone like Jade into because she's obviously having a bit of an identity crisis throughout the novel. And so much of her identity is being a lawyer because that's where her core friends are. That's how she met her boyfriend. That's what her parents want of her. And when she's slowly coming, kind of the realization is dawning that she can't continue the way that she is. I think that really rocks her, because one thing that I think a lot of my friends say is like, I am a lawyer. Whereas like most other people would say, I work in X industry or I work in this. Whereas like lawyers are like, this is who I am.
Right.
Which I think really kind of helps pile on this like identity confusion that she's going through.
Moving on to sort of the millennial literature question. I mean, do you think there's such a thing as the millennial novel? Sort of certain characteristics that our generation are depicting in literature setting?
I think there's a millennial anti-hero and anti-heroine. And it tends to be this sort of Sally Rooney, like My Year of Rest and Relaxation. They tend to be these sort of millennial women who they're going through something quite bad, whatever it is. Often is something quite degrading and debasing. But I do think one trait of the millennial anti-heroine is to kind of be really like sardonic about it and just kind of not quite, because I think Gen Z are really big on like processing it and dealing with it and putting in boundaries, whereas the millennial, she has to reach rock bottom before change can occur in the novels. And I think that's kind of quite a common thread in millennial novels.
Why do you think that is? Because, I mean, arguably our generation haven't been through anything that much worse. It probably had a much easier ride than previous generations. Because you're right, there's a sort of like millennial heroine who is, you know, one hot mess of sort of exuberance and suppression.
Yeah.
Why are our generation highlighting those kind of women, do you think? I mean, it's a bit of a big question, unfair for you to nail in 3 sentences.
I think there's sort of no aspect of millennial life that isn't totally suffused with anxiety. I think like you think back to sort of mid-century novels, people did sort of have this sort of looming dread, but it was always quite lofty and quite like noble. Whereas most millennial novels are really situated in day-to-day life. It's people literally trying to get through their day and trying to like navigate their relationships and their families. And it's kind of a lot less escapist. And I think when I think about, you know, when I go on Instagram or TikTok, I'm seeing like track your water intake, track your steps, monetize your hobbies,
Track your sleep.
And it's just like there's no
let up.
And I think that's why all these characters are quite just pushing forward and just trying to kind of get through it.
So I have a theory about the sort of millennial female disposition. I am zooming in on millennial women because I think in a way the most interesting literature of the last 20 years has been about millennial women, not millennial men, I would have to say. In a weird kind of way, our generation were fed this idea of you can do anything, you can be anything. We have this illusion of gender equality, and it was an illusion. And actually, with that came a lot of pressure, obviously. We were pushed through a sort of education sausage factory where you know, you sank or you swam. And actually, millennial women did actually better than millennial men in that. And then you had digitalization, which created comparison culture, created, you know, that anxiety, that social anxiety and that relentlessness. And then combined with that is a complete decline in religion and social convention.
Right.
Where so many of the novels of the like 60s and 70s are about breaking convention.
Yeah.
We didn't have any.
Yeah.
There was no expectation that we had to have babies by the time we were 25. In fact, it was really bad. I had much more lectures in schools about like don't get pregnant too young than actually what they should have been talking about was our fertility and that kind of stuff. And so we're sort of like this sort of messed up demographic who are like, you can be anything. There are no rules.
But actually that's
really anxiety inducing.
Well,
I want restriction. I want rigid. I want a straitjacket of societal convention because I know that path.
Yeah. I even think back to like you can be anything when I was like working full time.
Right.
I'm going to go be a published writer. Like it's kind of like that.
Yeah.
It was borderline delusional at the time. I mean,
well, clearly not, but yeah.
But like this sort of idea that you just keep going, you need to like, I guess it's like toxic productivity in a way. You have to put to use all the time.
Yes.
Whether
because
it's
your mothers didn't have it.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
This opportunity that you have, you've got to make use of it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And then fuse that with alcohol That's a very millennial. You can do anything. You can behave like a man in your alcohol consumption.
Quite like a ladette culture, especially in the 90s and the early noughties.
Which is not specific to millennials. But I do think there's something about that being one hot mess and turning to alcohol, potentially drugs, and potentially...
It's kind of romanticising it in a way.
Yeah, as certain coping strategies that don't actually end up helping you at all. They're slightly self-destructive, but not too self-destructive.
Yeah.
There's a kind of weird combination of like all sexual relationships being dysfunctional at a certain level. Parental relationships actually being quite benign, not always. But I think there's an interesting... You're not rebelling against your parents. I don't think there's as much in literature of the 50s and 60s. It was all about rebelling against that older generation. I don't think millennial literature has that same force. But the unifying theme is friendships. Yeah. Particularly female friendship. Yeah. And I wonder if you could speak about that, because that definitely is in Jaded.
We've come a long way from like early noughties where it was sort of mean girls and like women pitted against each other. They're kind of in competition with each other. And we've, we're now in this sort of new age. And when I think about sort of friendship being a cornerstone of millennial literature, I really think of like Dolly Alderton and Everything I Know About Love and this sort of really heartwarming relationships that, women have now started saying, like, my friends are the loves of my life. Yeah. And men kind of come and go. And
chosen family.
Exactly. I don't know whether the pivot of the focus away from romantic and sexual relationships, I don't know if it's to do with perhaps like online dating. I know like there used to be like Match.com and stuff, but now
it's all algorithmic love.
Yeah. And so you tend to kind of not necessarily have romantic relationships with someone that you grew up with or someone that went to the same school as you. It tends to be someone who came into your life really suddenly and potentially could go out really suddenly. And with that comes, people ghost you or just sort of disappear off the face of the earth. And as a result, that, could have reinforced that platonic love, for
of course,
people
for your
that
knew you and know the authentic you and have known you for a long time. Talking then finally about, the social media app now that dominates the publishing world, which is TikTok.
Yeah.
BookTok is taking over. What readers like, what books become bestsellers. As someone who is just beginning their lifetime career as a novelist, what do you think about the evolution of BookTok and I suppose the impact that Gen Z readers predominantly are having through that medium?
Yeah, I think back to when I was a child, I was like really described as bookish and like book obsessed, but that was like really synonymous with she's really quiet and she's a big introvert and I'm an only child and read a lot. And that was kind of, associated with being alone. It's sort of like a solitary activity. And I think BookTok has really changed that. It's sort of this like created this online community. Back in the day, there might have been like book clubs, but usually close-knit groups of friends rather than strangers on the internet. And I think what BookTok has done has taken what is a really solitary activity and turned it into this community that's just joined by this love of books. And for the first time, regular readers are sort of shaping a book's journey rather than publishing and marketing and all of those things are really important, but now it's regular readers have much more of a voice. And I think that does infuse a really kind of organic element to a book's journey, and I think it infuses an organic element to the relationship between the author and the reader. I think via BookTok and Bookstagram, readers have much more direct access to an author and kind of have much more like honest conversations. So I think it's a good thing, and I have found the community like really quite a joyful place.
Do you want to be like an author that's contactable and approachable? I mean, that sounds like hell. But like, isn't the joy of being a novelist like you kind of produce something maybe, every 2 years if you're super productive like you, and you sort of do the rounds and you come out and you do it and then you kind of go back into your little cubbyhole and you
we are sort of notoriously hermits.
And sort of, antisocial and just like and wanting to be projecting your thing when you have it ready and rather than constantly this feedback communication loop with your readers.
I think it's sort of with everything, it's a balance, isn't it? It's sort of now that Jaded has kind of gone to press and proofs are out in the world, I don't really view it as mine. It kind of like belongs to the reader and it's not mine anymore. Like I can't change anything in there. It's gone out to the world and it's on its own little journey. You know, I would love to know what readers think about it, and I'd love to have those conversations. But the other side of that coin is that with every sort of creative piece of work, you can't control how somebody is going to read it and interpret it, and there's like a joy to that. And I don't want to kind of influence that. I want people to kind of take what they need from the book for whatever time and point they're in their lives.
Amazing.
So yeah, it is a balance.
And that's a lovely way to look at it. It's your baby that's gone out into the world. And I'm pretty sure, absolutely confident that Jaded is going to have a journey to the stars, because it is a brilliant piece of work. It's so insightful. It's funny. It's tragic. It's brilliantly written. And I'm just so pleased that you are now able to put it into the world. So,
thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to It's All Relative. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter, TikTok and Instagram at Eliza Filby. And why not subscribe to my weekly newsletter to hear more from me about how we are changing as consumers, workers and as citizens. Oh, and do rate us on Apple Reviews. It helps me keep this podcast going.